I've always been a nature lover. There's something about being surrounded by the silence of the forest, far from everything, that made me feel at peace. So when my friend suggested camping in West Virginia, I was all in. The plan was simple. Spend a peaceful weekend in an RV, surrounded by the vast green of the mountains, with no cell service, no rush, no hustle. Just us and nature. West Virginia has always been a popular destination for those seeking isolation. The trails, the calm rivers, and the serenity of its untouched landscapes made the state the perfect getaway spot. But at the same time, there was something mysterious about it. Whispered stories of ancient Native American myths, places where people simply vanished, and the strange sounds of the forest at night. I'd heard those rumors, of course, but I never thought they were anything more than campfire tales. We rented a spacious RV, enough to fit the four of us. There was something exciting about the idea of hitting the road, stopping wherever we wanted, exploring new places. The weather was perfect, a mix of warmth and a cool breeze, as if nature itself was inviting us on an adventure. The trip started off great, full of laughs, jokes, and music. The road wound through mountains covered in dense trees, and with every turn, the scenery grew more dramatic, as if guiding us deeper into an ancient story. The excitement of the beginning of the journey kept me from noticing the first signs of what was to come. When we arrived at the campsite, we were struck by the tranquility of the place. The parking lot was empty, except for a trailer at the far end, its curtains drawn. There were no other vehicles, and we didn't hear any voices. A heavy peace hung in the air, and the only sound was the rustling of the leaves. We set up our camp next to a clearing, about 100 yards from a gently flowing river. It was the kind of place that looked like it came straight out of a painting, the kind of tranquility you expect when you decide to disconnect from the world. But soon, I started to notice something strange. It wasn't obvious, but it was there, an unusual silence, thicker than usual, as if even the sounds of the forest were distant, muffled. That night, after a simple dinner, we decided to take a walk around the area. The trees seemed even denser as we ventured deeper, and the darkness began to close in around us. It felt as if we were stepping into another dimension, where the real world no longer existed. That's when we found the first sign that something was off. In the middle of the forest, a small patch of ground was visibly more worn than the rest, as if something had been dragged there. I crouched down to take a closer look and saw what appeared to be a line of carefully placed stones, forming a circle. Probably something old, maybe a hunting spot, I thought, trying to push away the strange feeling that was beginning to creep in. My friend Dave, who was always up for exploring, suggested we should go a bit further, but something stopped me. Something in the air, maybe the stronger wind that was now blowing, made me want to head back to the camp. "Let's go back," I said. "We've got all day tomorrow to explore." That night, the silence became even more oppressive. There were no crickets, no distant sounds of nighttime animals, just the wind through the trees, which now seemed more like a whisper than a breeze. I lay down in the RV bed, trying to convince myself that it was all just my imagination. But deep down, a sense of unease consumed me. Something wasn't right about this place, something I couldn't identify, but it made me look out the RV window more times than I would have liked. And so, as the darkness deepened outside, one simple question formed in my mind. Why was no one else here? That night would be the first of many I would never forget. The next morning brought a momentary sense of relief. The sun bathed the campsite, casting a soft light on the trees around us that should have brought comfort, but felt more like a diffused glow, as if trying to hide something. Still, everyone was excited, eager to explore more of the area, and soon we were all up, ready for the day. But something bothered me, as if the air, despite being fresh and clear, was heavy with an invisible tension, a quiet pressure I couldn't describe. The river was calm, but the water, which would normally shimmer under the sunlight, looked dull, darker than usual. I found myself staring at it more than I should have, as if trying to find some meaning in that murky water. We decided to take a longer walk through the forest. The path was narrow, winding between tall trees that seemed to close in on us, creating a green, silent tunnel. There were no bird sounds, no signs of animal life, just the sound of our footsteps and the occasional crunch of leaves underfoot. I felt the presence of the place, something unnatural. It was as if the forest itself was watching us. As we walked, we passed a clearing, and there, among the vegetation, I saw something that immediately made me stop. Strange marks on the ground. They weren't footprints, but something more ritualistic. Stones arranged in a circular pattern, as if something had been drawn there, as if someone had taken obsessive care to create it. It was a symbol, but not one I recognized. Something felt wrong, very wrong. "Are you guys seeing this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. But when I looked at the others, I saw they were just as uncomfortable as I was. "It's just a circle of stones, nothing big," Dave said, trying to brush off the tension with a nervous smile. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been placed there on purpose, as if we were being watched, as if we were intruding on something we shouldn't. And I knew that the silent presence of the forest was watching us, waiting. We returned to the RV earlier than planned, and when we got there, the atmosphere felt thicker. There was something in the air, like an invisible electricity, making the hairs on my body stand up. Suddenly, what had seemed like a peaceful, tranquil spot now felt suffocating, threatening. Even the sound of the wind had changed, as if it was whispering words I couldn't understand. That night, we sat around the campfire, trying to relax, but the discomfort was palpable. We were all quieter than usual, our eyes growing more attuned to the forest around us, as if we were waiting for something to emerge from the shadows. I couldn't stop staring into the depths of the forest, where the darkness seemed to swallow any light. That's when I heard the first strange sound. It was like a snap coming from the direction of the trees. Not a natural sound, but something weaker, as if someone was trying to move through the underbrush without being seen. We all looked at the same spot, where the darkness seemed thicker. The snap was followed by another, then a series of them, one after the other. Were they footsteps? Something was moving toward our camp. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, my voice now quieter, tinged with rising anxiety. But no one answered. We were all looking at the same spot, trying to make sense of what was happening. I could feel the fear starting to grow among us, like an invisible force spreading, uniting our concerns into a shared tension. And then, as if someone was watching us, the campfire suddenly went out. A cold wind sliced through the air, and I saw a shadow moving at the edge of the forest. It wasn't a shadow of a tree or something familiar. It was a shape, a human outline, but distorted, as if it didn't belong there. My stomach twisted into a tight knot. Something was wrong here. Something was watching us. Something that shouldn't be. I couldn't take it anymore. "Let's get inside the RV," I said, my voice sounding more urgent than I intended. But before we could move, we heard a scream. A sharp scream, coming from the direction of the forest. A scream that didn't sound human, but cut through the air like a blade. And it was at that moment that we knew, without saying a word, that we were in danger. That place was not safe. I just didn't know how far that night of terror would take us. That night seemed to drag on, as if time had distorted. The scream we had heard still echoed in my mind, repeating like a dark melody that couldn't be erased. We all ran back to the RV, but the feeling that something was chasing us didn't let us rest. We hurriedly locked all the doors and windows, but no one dared turn on the interior light. The darkness felt safer than any attempt to understand what was happening outside that vehicle. Inside the RV, the silence was absolute, except for the sound of our heavy breathing and the weak headlights that briefly lit up the path outside. We all sat around the table, eyes fixed on the hallway, as if at any moment something could emerge from the darkness that had taken over the outside world. I could feel everyone's gaze on me, as if they were waiting for me to say something, to explain the situation. But the truth was, I didn't know what was happening. None of us knew. It was an animal, Dave said, trying to force a sense of normalcy. It must have been an animal, a bear or something. They live around here, right? I wasn't sure if he actually believed that, or if he was just trying to calm us down. But the problem was, I knew it wasn't a bear. The sound we heard wasn't an animal scream. It was human, but I didn't dare say that out loud. The fear that had spread through the air was too palpable. Hours passed and no one moved. The night seemed longer with every passing minute, the pressure mounting as the silence deepened. Then something happened, something that made my heart stop for a second. The sound of something hitting the side of the RV. It was soft at first, as if something was brushing against the wall, but it quickly turned into a firm, almost rhythmic thump. The knocking came from all sides non-stop, as if we were surrounded. Our eyes met, but no one dared make a move. I knew that if I looked out the window, I wouldn't find what I was expecting. I knew that what was out there shouldn't be seen. And then, the silence returned suddenly. But something had changed. I could feel it in the air. A presence, stronger than before, watching from the depths of the darkness. Without warning, Steve abruptly stood up and walked to the door. I'm going to see what this is. We can't keep going like this. Steve, no! I shouted, trying to stop him, but he didn't listen. He was hypnotized by something, as if the need to understand what was happening had completely taken hold of him. Before anyone could react, Steve was already outside, the RV doors slamming behind him. The darkness seemed to swallow his figure as soon as he passed the headlights, but he didn't care. I could see him heading toward the forest, without hesitation. Steve, come back! I shouted, but my voice seemed to get lost in the night. There was a moment of silence, and then the forest responded with a sound I couldn't identify. It wasn't a scream, but something deeper, more primal. Something that resonated in the trees, that seemed to travel through the ground and crawl through the roots. It was as if the earth itself was moving. The RV was in panic. Everyone started banging on the walls, trying to call Steve back, but the knocks that now echoed around the vehicle no longer seemed only external. They were inside too. Something was moving in the forest, and it seemed to be rapidly approaching us. And that's when I saw it. The shadow that was looming in the trees, now closer, more defined. It wasn't a man. It wasn't a creature. It was a vague shape, but one so dark that it seemed to consume the light around it. There was no face, just the presence of emptiness. Something was wrong there. In a moment of pure desperation, I looked out the RV window, trying to see something, anything. And that's when I saw Steve again, standing in the middle of the clearing, staring at us. His eyes were fixed but empty, as if he wasn't really seeing us, as if he were being controlled by something or someone. He didn't move, but his posture was rigid, as if waiting. Steve! I shouted, banging on the window, but he didn't respond. The shadow behind him started to move, and I realized it was getting closer, as if it were crawling on the ground, advancing toward us, faster than could be natural. That's when someone screamed, "It's coming!" I turned to look and saw a creature, a distorted silhouette emerging from the darkness, following Steve's path. It wasn't a human figure, but something that seemed to be formed by the night itself, by the darkness of the forest. Its limbs twisted in an unnatural way, as if it were a being made of nightmares. Every movement seemed incomplete, as if it were trying to take on a solid form. I knew we didn't have time. "Close the doors! Quickly!" I shouted, but it was too late. The RV shook violently when the creature hit the vehicle. The sound was deafening, as if an invisible force was trying to crush it. I didn't know how long we could hold out. Panic took over all of us as we tried to lock the doors, but it seemed useless. Each knock grew stronger, angrier, and the feeling that we were being surrounded intensified with every passing second. "We have to get out of here," Sarah screamed, trying to pull the door, but it was stuck. The fear in her voice was palpable. "Hurry! We need to run now." I looked through the side window and saw Steve again. Now, he was closer, standing right in front of the RV. His eyes were completely empty, as if his soul had been ripped from him. He no longer seemed human. His body was rigid, moving only with the force of something beyond life. I tried to shout at him, but my voice was blocked by the growing anguish. There was something wrong with Steve, something deeply wrong. The shadow of the creature dragged itself through the trees, now visible by the faint light of the headlights. I could feel its weight, a presence that seemed to crush the air around us. Its movements were slow, almost as if it were feeding off the night itself, but when its eyes locked onto the window, I knew it was too late. It knew we were there. An inexplicable pressure began to grow inside the RV. The air thickened, as if something was draining the energy from all of us. Our breaths grew heavier, and every sound seemed amplified to the extreme. I could hear my heart beating in my chest, faster with each beat. "Steve, for God's sake, run!" I shouted, but he didn't move. His eyes were fixed on us, as if he was waiting for something we couldn't understand. That's when the creature revealed itself completely. The shadow dissipated enough for us to see its distorted form, but what I saw was something I could never have imagined. It wasn't a beast nor a physical being. It was something beyond any comprehension. Its extremities were made of a dark, liquid substance, as if it was made of pure liquid darkness, flowing across the ground, molding itself as it advanced. Its arms were long and thin, like tentacles, and with each movement, it seemed to tear at the fabric of reality around it. When it lifted one of its hands, I could see the long, sharp claws, as if they were made of a material that shouldn't exist. Its hands weren't made of flesh. They were made of a substance that seemed to disintegrate and reform with every instant. Then it spoke, not with a voice, but with a mental presence, a direct invasion into my mind. Its words weren't words. They were images, thoughts that were forced into my head. "You shouldn't have come." The sense of despair overwhelmed me. It wasn't just a physical threat. It was an existential one, something beyond everything we knew. I tried to fight the pressure in my mind, but it was useless. My vision began to blur, and fear overtook me like an immeasurable wave. Each thud against the RV seemed to make the ground shake, and the walls felt like they were closing in on us. "We have to get out," Dave yelled, finally managing to unlock the door. But before he could open it all the way, the RV jolted so violently that we were all thrown forward. The door suddenly swung open, and the darkness surrounding us seemed to swallow everything. There was no turning back, no escape anymore. As we stepped out of the RV, the forest felt alive, like it was breathing, moving in response to our presence. The fear I felt was indescribable. The trees around us seemed to bend, as though they were watching us, as if something inside was waiting for us. Then, with a quick movement, Steve's figure appeared again in front of us. But he wasn't alone anymore. Alongside him, a much larger figure emerged. A shadow in the shape of a human, but with eyes that glowed with an inhuman light. Steve was changed. He wasn't him anymore. He was being controlled by something we couldn't understand. "Steve, you have to come back." I tried to shout, but my voice came out as a whisper, as if something was silencing me. That's when we saw what was happening. Whatever had taken control of Steve was now taking control of the entire forest. The trees began moving erratically, as though they had a life of their own. The ground trembled beneath our feet, and the sound of something dragging along the earth drew closer. And in the midst of all this, the voice returned, louder than ever, filling our minds. "Never leave the forest again. There is no way out." The words echoed in our heads, and everything began to darken. The darkness consumed everything. It wasn't an ordinary night. It was as if the night itself was stretching, expanding endlessly, swallowing every trace of light. I could barely see anything beyond shadows and motion and distorted shapes, all seeming to stretch and twist. The feeling that time had been lost was palpable. I looked at my friends, but they seemed so far away, as if an invisible layer separated us, something that made communication nearly impossible. The sound of the forest was the most disturbing, the branches cracking as though they were breaking unnaturally, the whisper of the wind now a constant murmur, a muffled call, as though something was trying to lure us deeper into the total darkness. My eyes slowly adjusted to the dark, and I finally realized what was happening. The forest wasn't just a forest. It was a prison. The trees, now leafless, had a spectral hue. Their trunks no longer seemed natural, as though they were made of something far more sinister, something organic and, at the same time, monstrous. I looked back where the RV had been, but it seemed to have been swallowed by the darkness. I could see nothing now except a mass of black, liquid-like shadows riding around where it had been parked. Steve was standing in front of me, but he was no longer Steve. He was motionless, his eyes empty, a frozen expression on his face, as if whatever remained of his soul had been drained. He was there, but he was no longer him. Whatever had taken him was now in control of everything. "Steve, please, listen to me." I tried to call out, but my voice seemed to disappear into the darkness, swallowed by that abyss of fear. He didn't respond. There was no trace of humanity left in him. With every step we took, the trees closed in around us, as if they wanted to trap us there forever. And with each step, the ground beneath us grew harder to move across. It was no longer earth, but a viscous, sticky substance that crawled as if it were alive. "We can't keep going like this," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "The forest is devouring us." I knew she was right. The feeling of being consumed by something beyond reality, by something so vast and incomprehensible, was overwhelming. What surrounded us wasn't just a place. It was a force, a presence, something that wanted us to feel small, powerless, something that wanted to erase us. Then, we heard a sound that interrupted the silent nightmare. A scream that didn't sound human. "It's Sarah!" Dave shouted, pointing to where she had been, but she was no longer there. She had disappeared, as if she had been pulled into the earth, swallowed by the darkness of the forest. "Sarah!" I screamed, running toward her, but it was useless. The forest seemed to swallow every sound we made, every movement we took. It was as if it was slowly disintegrating us. We tried to run, but the branches of the trees closed in on us, like clawed hands trying to pull us away. I felt trapped, my breath becoming faster and faster, fear tightening around my chest. Each step I took seemed to lead me deeper into an endless abyss. "There's no way out," the mental voice from before returned, deep, cold, emotionless. It invaded my mind, paralyzing me. "No one who enters here can leave. All of you are mine now." I looked at the others, but I couldn't find any of their gazes. They were as lost as I was. Fear bound us together, but it also tore us apart. We were being consumed, not just by the forest, but by whatever kept us there, trapped inside this distorted reality. Then, the shadow appeared again, dragging itself from the trees, a shape that didn't make sense. It looked more like an abstraction, a nightmare in motion. Its claws scraped the ground with a muffled sound, but the impact reverberated in my mind. It looked at me. "You never should have come." That was the last thing I heard before feeling the ground beneath me open up. The darkness swallowed me, pulling me down to a place where there was no light, where reality itself seemed to melt away. And then, the only thing left was absolute silence. The darkness didn't wrap around me the way it had before. Now, it wasn't a presence, but an absence. As if I were floating in a space without time, without space, where there was no sound, no light, no air, just an inert vastness, where my existence seemed to have dissolved, becoming part of something much larger. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The sound of my breath, the beating of my heart, everything that should have been real seemed to be erased by the vastness of the place. There were no boundaries, nothing, just me and nothingness. I didn't know how much time had passed. It could have been seconds, hours, or an eternity. The concept of time was distorted, trapped in the immobility of what surrounded me. Then, something changed. I started to hear a whisper, a low, distant sound that seemed to come from all directions at once. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely unfamiliar either. It was as if the very environment itself was speaking to me, communicating with the deepest part of my mind, where fear and hopelessness were becoming all I knew. You're lost, you don't understand, you're one among many. The voice seemed to echo in my mind. The sensation of being consumed by it was overwhelming. I wanted to scream, run, do anything to escape this communication, but there was nowhere to go. Everything was unchanging, frozen in a state of confusion. They never knew, and neither will you. Those words repeated endlessly, like an unbroken mantra. I didn't know who they were referring to, but I soon realized they were directed at me. It was as if the place I was in had a consciousness of its own, an intelligence that watched me, that knew me better than I knew myself. And somehow, it wanted me to be a part of it. At that moment, a faint light appeared before me. It wasn't a normal light, neither warm nor soft. It was a cold light, frigid, as if it didn't belong to a physical world, but something beyond it. It expanded slowly, revealing what seemed like a door, an opening, a path, something that promised an escape. I knew I shouldn't go. Something told me the exit was a deception, a trap disguised as hope. But the fear gnawing at me, the need to escape, pushed me to take a step toward the light. Perhaps it was the only chance I would have to leave, to return to the real world, if it still existed. As I got closer to the light, a figure appeared in front of me, floating in the darkness. It was Steve, or at least, it was Steve's form. But something was wrong with him. His body seemed distorted, the features of his face blurred and undefined. His eyes were completely black, with no pupils, no life. He wasn't himself anymore. You never should have come. Steve's voice wasn't his anymore. It was a distorted echo, a whisper that made the skin on my body crawl. He extended his hand, but not in a human way. It was more like a shadow, an extension of the darkness that seemed to want to swallow me whole. I wanted to step back, but my legs didn't respond. I was paralyzed, trapped in an invisible chain that kept me from escaping. The figure in front of me smiled, or at least it seemed to smile, but not in a way I could understand. It was a smile of pain, of despair, an expression of someone who had already lost everything. There's no escape, you know that. The light before me flickered, as if it were fading, and for a moment, I thought maybe the door was indeed salvation. But before I could reach it, the whisper in my mind grew louder, filling every thought, every spark of reasoning. Everything you see, everything you feel, is a reflection, a lie created by us. There is no escape for those who have already been consumed. And at that instant, the door disappeared, the light extinguished, and all that remained was the densest darkness. I was no longer floating. I was trapped. I had always been trapped. The silence returned. It was no longer the emptiness of before. Now, it was a complete silence, total, absolute. A silence that could not be broken by anything, not by thoughts, not by words. The last thing I felt was a cold touch, a frozen embrace that wrapped around me and pulled me into a shapeless, endless place. And there, in total darkness, something whispered to me once more, with a voice that seemed to come from all directions. "You will never escape." And then everything dissolved,